Good morning, everyone. I'm Indu Saxena, and it's my privilege and great honor to welcome you all here today at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers' second international conference titled Alliances and Partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, Elevating Strategies and Interest. This is the third day and the eighth panel of the conference. We will conclude it tomorrow with 3 more panels and a total of 11 panels. The conference is partnering with Wisconsin Veteran Museum, Wisconsin Madison, Amity International Institute Studies, Amity University, Noida, India, and American International University, Bangladesh, Dhaka. It's endorsed by Graduate School, Newark, Rutgers University, USA. This panel is focused on the emerging world order after the Russia-Ukraine war and will generate the discussion and some kind of policy recommendations. With that, now I would like to take the opportunity with Dr. Zahid and Mr. Chris Kowalski to introduce the stellar speakers. We have Professor Simon Reich here. Professor Simon Reich has been a professor in the Division of Global Affairs and Department of Political Science at Rutgers Newark campus since 2008. He also holds an appointment as Chercheur Associate at the Center for International Studies, CERI, at Sciences Po Paris. He is now also a co-editor of the Oxford Studies in Grand Strategy. He previously worked at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public and International Affairs for over 2 decades, where he served as the inaugural director of the Ford Institute of Human Security. Professor Reich has been the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships, including an International Affairs Fellowship from the Council of Foreign Relations in the Policy World. He has also worked at the US Congressional Office of Technology Assessment in Washington and served as the Director of Research and Analysis at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House in London. Dr. Reich has published 13 books. His current work is The Age of Fuzzy Bifurcation. His most recent articles on the subject appears in the Eurasia Review last week and the Transatlantic Policy Review in September. Welcome, Professor Reich. We have Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, and it's deeply humbling to introduce Dr. Mahapatra. He's a founder and honorary chairperson of Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Study, and formerly Pro-Vice Chancellor and Professor of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India. With 30 years of teaching and creating new knowledge, Professor Mahapatra is almost an authority in this field. His extensive work, engagement, and original thoughts are encapsulated in many books, research articles, presentations, and commentaries. Professor Mahapatra's scholastic engagement also includes member of UGC, University Grant Commission in India, and various think tanks in India related to the security and international security and international relations. He has conducted research in several US presidential libraries and US National Archives in Washington and British Public Record Office in London. Recently, he was Tagore Chair Professor at Yunnan University of China. Welcome, Professor Mahapatra. And we have Professor Nagalaxmi M. Raman. They are our knowledge partners with this conference. Professor Nagalaxmi is the director and head of Amity Institute of International Studies, Amity University, Noida, India. She served as project director in multiple projects with the alignment of the agencies in the USA, United Kingdom, Japan, and World Bank. She has 30 years of experience of teaching India's foreign policy, sustainable development, political theory, comparative politics, and governments, and globalization and public administration. She has several publications, including her most recent book, Synergizing India-Africa Relations. Welcome, Dr. Nagalaxmi. Now I would like to hand over to Zahid and followed by Chris for the for the introduction of the rest of the speaker. Dr. Zahid, over to you.
All right. So do we start with the so we have Dr. Mehmed Ali, the Chief Learning Officer for the Space Forces at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. Dr. Ali has nearly 3 decades of extensive experience in academic management, archival preservation, and public history, following 7 years overseeing a partnership with the University of Massachusetts and the National Park Service. He served with the State Department in Iraq for 4 years. He has a unique blend of academic and executive experience. Dr. Ali directly managed several funding programs targeted at rebuilding civic, educational, and cultural infrastructure. He also worked in Afghanistan for USAID and supervised several work groups for Yale University, including Yale University Library, which I know is very rich in its publication list. The Teaching and Learning Center, the Registrar's Office. It's good to see someone also like me working in the Registrar's Office, and the Yale University Press. Welcome to the panel. Have we left anyone?
Yeah, we have Dr. Ellis. Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Ellis is a research professor at Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, with a focus on the region's relationship with China and other non-Western hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism in the region. He has published over 440 works, including 5 books. The most recent one in 2002 was China Engages Latin America, Distorting Development and Democracy. Dr. Ellis' professional stint includes serving as the Secretary of the state's policy planning staff for Latin America and Caribbean, and on international narcotics and law enforcement issues. He was awarded the Order of Military Merit, Jose Maria Cordova, by the Colombian government for his scholarship on security issues. In his academic capacity, Dr. Ellis presented his work on a broad range of public business and government forums, including providing testimony to the US Congress on various occasions. He's a regular commentator in radio and television programs, and cited regularly in print media, both in the United States and Latin America, for his works. Welcome to the panel, Doctor. With that, to set the stage, allow me to share my 2 cents on the topic. So it has almost become a truism to claim that the world order is changing. And some has described it as an inflection point. Others sees it at a crossroad. And in the corridors of Kremlin, it was described as we are now witnessing changes of which we haven't seen in 100 years. So one of the most cited and if not compelling piece of evidence for this change emerged when nearly 35 states, representing 2/3 of the world population, abstained in UN votes condemning Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. This was regarded as a deeply disturbing phenomena and to the protection of sovereignty norms of the UN Charter. The geopolitical split over the Ukraine war emerged starkly again at the G20 summit, which is recently concluded, where a consensus could only be reached on a watered down leaders' declaration. Now, from a historical perspective, such a global split in sovereignty norm is not new. In South Asian context, during the similar occurrence of sovereignty norm violation of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union in 1980, it was only 18 states, including India, who abstained from condemning USSR. China, including 104 countries, however, condemned the Soviet Union for the invasion. These evidences and more suggest that the change in China's long-held position on the sovereignty norm and India's continued alignment with Russia exposed by the Ukraine war perhaps lies in the debate of defining a new geopolitical split. Such split, though not unprecedented, has promoted the renewed call for a rule-based global order grounded on democracy, human rights, multilateralism, and market economy by most of the Western countries. So amidst such geopolitical realities, the key question confronting us is that what ideas and values should define the emerging world order? How practical it is to hope that the greater emphasis on sovereignty norm, democracy, rule of law, and human rights will be able to shape the emerging world order. What will be the methods and process for the like-minded partners and alliances to work towards maintaining peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region? Can the economic interdependence and transnational ties remain strong enough to prevent a complete lapse into anarchy and unrestrained competition, protecting the international system based on United Nations Charter? Will the emerging global order be geared towards planetary realism as it emerged in the US and the other places, as a whole earth thinking to meet the global challenges such as the threats of climate change, global pandemic, and poverty? So with that initial remarks, let me now invite the panelists to deliberate on this issue. And the first, can we go with Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, please? Unmute, sir.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, and let me thank Indu for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts. World order always keeps emerging. So emerging world order means nothing. It always emerges, never static. Of course, it depends. Sometimes after 40 years, sometimes after 50 years, but the world order is never static. Political, economic, and strategic developments do not allow world order to be really static and fixed. For better understanding of course, the concept of world order, many scholars demarcate or identify different world orders, like, for example, post-Second World War order, bipolar, multipolar, unipolar world order during Cold War, after the Cold War, etc. Whenever major developments take place, such as the World War, or beginning and continuation of the Cold War, end of the Cold War, disintegration of the Soviet Union, terrorist attack on the United States, Arab Spring, rise of China, relative decline of the United States, and of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine, they do affect, shape, reshape, disrupt, or alter world order to a certain extent. However, in my view, there is no single world order that one can think of. World is too big, too huge, too amorphous, too diverse to talk about one world order. It is perhaps more relevant to talk about international orders. There are many international orders in the world at any given time. And international orders, more than one of them, can coexist, as it happened after the end of the Second World War. Of course, there was a liberal international order championed by and led by the United States of America. And then there was a smaller socialist international order led by the former Soviet Union. And many people don't talk about it, not even in the developing countries. There was a non-aligned international order that actually outnumbered in terms of membership the other two orders. At the strategic level, the international order during the Cold War was, of course, bipolar. And in fact, I would say soon after World War II, it was a unipolar world order when the US had the monopoly of the nuclear weapons and accounted for about 50% of the global output. The world was actually unipolar at that time. Then slowly, it gave way to a bipolar system with the rise of the Soviet Union and Soviet Union going nuclear and flexing its ideological and even military muscle. Then by the late 1960s and 70s, we could see slow movement towards a multipolar structure with the rise of Europe and Japan as economic powerhouses, which played certain amount of role even in decision-making in the international affairs. And then after that, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, which yet again led to a unipolar strategic order in the 1990s, early 1990s. Now, the terrorist attack on the US, the global war on terror, and the military intervention of NATO forces and the United States in Afghanistan, and then the rise of China made it very clear that unilateralism under a unipolar order was no longer feasible. Even before the Russian military intervention in Ukraine, China had come to be seen as a geopolitical competitor or rival, potential rival of the United States. Now, then comes the Ukraine war in a very big way. Russia slowly reasserted itself as a powerful geopolitical actor. The Russian role in the Georgian crisis, in Crimea, Syria, Donbass, and now war against Ukraine symbolize the geopolitical weight of the Russian Federation. Its ability to sustain the war since February 2022, despite massive American sanctions and arming of Ukraine, indicate the resilience of the Russian Federation as a geopolitical heavyweight. It may be a pygmy in terms of its economic wealth compared to that of the United States and China, but its nuclear and missile capability make it a military superpower, which nobody can dispute. The persistent military conflict in Ukraine raises many questions about the yet again emerging international order. One should not again talk about a pre-Ukraine world order and post-Ukraine world order. It would be a mistake to do so because many developments are taking place slowly over the years, over the decades, that really help in shaping the world order. But one can certainly analyze the emerging international order in the following way. Very briefly, I'll talk in a way, telegraphic manner because of the limitation of time. We can have a discussion later. So, the end of the Second World War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union brought about structural changes in the international order. But in my view, the rise of China and the assertive Russia are very unlikely to bring about any major structural change in the international order. Both Russia and China have greatly benefited from the liberal economic order and will continue to respect the United Nations, Bretton Woods structures, and the WTO like many other powers, and will neither be capable nor they would desire to dismantle such structures like the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO and the United Nations. Next point. Throughout the post-Second World War era and in the midst of the Cold War, the former Soviet Union and its allies, of course, frequently challenged the Western liberal order. There is no doubt about it. And even now, challenges of various kinds to the same liberal order is there and will be there. And some people, have begun to write the obituary of the liberal order. I don't agree with them. I think this particular order will continue, but there will be challenges. For example, the expansion of the BRICS. Attempt by some countries, some members of BRICS, to de-dollarize trade, lessen the dependence on the American dollar, and start doing trade and other economic activities by either swap of their currency or using some other currency, BRICS currency. And then, of course, they will continue to struggle to promote a kind of multilateralism where China, Russia, and even emerging economies, including India, can play a much larger role. And this kind of activities will certainly pose some kind of challenge to the existing US-led liberal order. I would say that even France, Germany, and to a certain extent the European Union will also seek to reduce the dominant US voice in decision-making, and they will try to have some role and they would like to play some role in the decision-making on major international affairs. Next point, the Global South, again, will also struggle to have its own voice heard. During the non-aligned movement, many leaders of NAM were seeking to reform the international economic order and the international information order during the Cold War. After the Cold War, non-alignment became irrelevant, but now yet again, the Global South is emerging as a group of nations, and all the major powers are trying to really quote them right now. In the emerging international order, a complex and varied set of mini Cold Wars between the United States and China and the US and Russia will keep on recurring. The fear of Russia and China forming a formidable alliance to confront the United States, in my view, is very unlikely. Both Russia and China are more likely to selectively collaborate in challenging the US policies, probably on a case-by-case basis. The reasons are very simple, in my view. Russia will not play second fiddle to China, and the United States and China's economic interdependence will prevent China from fully aligning with Russia on all issues. Next point, the global south has replaced the non-aligned movement now. It will continue to seek reform of the United Nations and other structures of the global governance that can protect their interests and not make them more and more vulnerable to geopolitics. Emerging economies, including India, will also have more influence in global political economy, as indicated by the formation of G20, which apparently is more relevant, more important to tackle the global financial problems than G7 ever could, ever since the globalization began in 2007 and 8. In other words, I would say there will be incremental changes to the international order even after the end of the Ukraine war. I'll conclude my remarks by just responding to the point that was made about India's role in the Ukraine war and India supporting Russia and all. I think India has taken a very nuanced position. India has not supported the Russian aggression in Ukraine, although its voting behavior indicated otherwise. India is buying Russian oil for certain, but then European countries are also buying Russian oil, more Russian oil than India does. India has supplied even humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Prime Minister Modi, openly in dialoguing with Mr. Putin, said this is not the era of war. And this particular statement was repeated even in G20 statement in Indonesia. So while India will continue to have relationship with Russia, India will not support aggression at all. Lastly, let me underline this fact that India did not oppose American and Western sanctions against Russia. With these brief points, I yet again thank all of you for your patient listening to me, and thank you, Indu, for this great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mahapatra. That's very interesting, and we are happy to have you at this panel. The Global South is a moment, now a moment, and definitely the G20 that you mentioned, and like we have been listening the speakers since last 2 days, and some of are arguing that the shape and the structure of the G7 is going to change in next 2 or 3 years. So who country are going to be the G7 and who are coming out from the G7? So we will take this in QA session. Now I would like to invite Dr. Ellis for his remarks. Professor Ellis,
Indu, thank you very much, and thanks to the group for this opportunity to share my remarks. Just need to mention that I'm currently employed by the U.S. Army, so all of my remarks will strictly represent my own personal opinions, which I will express very clearly. So you had asked me to talk a little bit about the dimension of what is happening in the Middle East, as well as linking that to Russia in a broader global context. And so relatively quickly, let me start with just some observations on what's happened with Gaza and Israel's response in the past couple of weeks. First of all, to me, the amount of planning over 2 years that went into the October 7th attacks involving thousands of people and impressive levels of secrecy, to me, shows two things. Number one, it was planned by Hamas from the very beginning with strategic effect. And number two, it clearly had the support of Iran in terms of intelligence and other things behind that. Hamas, along with Hezbollah and the Houthis and others being linked, of course, to Iran. For me, what Hamas attempted to do is consistent with what traditionally terrorist organizations and indeed guerrilla organizations have historically sought to do, which is not to defeat the enemy, but to try to provoke the enemy into a response that shows to the broader society the enemy's bad nature and leads the enemy into a counter response, which exhausts the enemy. One can make similar parallels to what Al-Qaeda tried to do with the September 11th attacks, drawing the U.S. into a war in the Middle East that would effectively exhaust its resources in the context of a rising China. Having said this, important to also note that for me, it wasn't just the desire to provoke an attack, expecting this particular government, this particular Likud government would respond the way it did. It would have to respond, but also anticipating through the structuring of its presence in Gaza to try to make the response by Israel as long and as casualty heavy on both sides as possible. One can see that through the hostages that were taken, through the structure of tunnels which were prepared, through the location of operations under and around refugee areas, as we just saw again tragically with Jabalia. And of course, there is a broader question of, to what degree is what Hamas has done in coordination with other Iranian proxies, and we've seen the coordinated responses in terms of Lebanon's response from Hezbollah, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in terms of the strategic effects on the global world order, let me go through a quick list. Number one, I think that there has been an enormous and it will be a sustained effect generating protracted instability in the Middle East and a marginalization for the middle term of U.S. influence and ability to address that, with Saudi Arabia and Iran continuing to essentially jockey for influence among other actors. So first of all, that's based on an assumption that this will continue to drag out. Despite U.S. pressure, the Israelis are unlikely to let up. And they're also unlikely to be able to pacify the Gaza Strip anytime soon. Also, there will probably be continued problems for the U.S.-Israel relationship as some of the sensitivities over Israel's response plays out within U.S. politics. Given that, certainly when we look at the Middle East, you can see that what was an important prior strategic trend, which was the reconciliation between Israel and certain moderate Arab nations, especially those seen with the Abraham Accords, that seems off the table. Indeed, the most significant near-term strategic effect was probably the stopping of the Saudi Arabia-Israel deal, which was in progress, and frankly, making it very difficult for other moderate states in the region to deal either with Israel or even deal with the United States. We saw that in terms of public pressures that even prevented meetings by several leaders in the region with President Biden when he visited. And again, an important effect of that is that given that the U.S. influence in the region was largely through these relatively moderate states, what we're seeing again is that a significant undercutting of that U.S. influence. Beyond that, because I worked in Latin America, I wanted to mention that within Latin America, like other parts of the world, you have multiple effects. Number one, the marginalization of the Israeli position commercially and politically. Already Bolivia, Colombia, and Chile have withdrawn ambassadors, and Bolivia has canceled relations with Israel. Also, enormous economic stress, which will bring political transformation to Latin America, like other parts of the region, with the expected significant increase in oil prices. And depending on how far things go between the U.S. and Iran with this escalation, it will depend in part how much those prices increase. I think we can also expect to see changes in the level of flows of money for addressing the needs of the Palestinian population from the Lebanese Syrian diaspora in Latin America, like other parts of the world, as well as the continuation of Iran's rapprochement, which already had begun in 2020 with Iran-Israel and was emphasized recently with the Iranian visit to Venezuela. As well as Nicaragua and Cuba, and the significant defense cooperation agreement between Iran and Bolivia. We may even see some resumption of terrorism against Jewish targets and possibly U.S. targets in Latin America, which is not without precedent. We saw this in of course, 1992 with the Hezbollah attacks against the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, and the attack in 1994 against the Jewish Community Center, AIIMA. And so it's not unthinkable that, as with other parts of the world where we're already seeing these escalating attacks, we'll see that. Now, more broadly, in terms of global effects, to go back to a previous point, number one, likely a increase in oil prices. Interestingly enough, that increase may cause the PRC to try to restrain Iran, important client to some degree, given the PRC dependence on oil, including substantially Iranian oil. Number two, getting to the Ukraine war, I think it's been enormously significant already how this is diverting attention and money and arms within Washington away from Ukraine. And indeed, as Ukraine arrives at its winter period, which makes advances on the ground very, very complicated, it's likely that its inability during the past months to get the breakthroughs that it expected, that will become even more profound, giving Russia opportunities to retrench, making it likely that the Ukraine war will continue at least through the next year, 2024, with very high levels of bloodshed, likely tying down both Russia and others. At the same time, increasing divisions in Europe and in the United States over the funding of what seems now a very prolonged conflict, and also divisions in between the U.S. and Europe, likely over what's happening with Israel in its response in Gaza, will probably fracture what had seen, or at least will introduce some tensions into what had seemed to be one of the great successes in recent years, the re-strengthening of the U.S. role with Europe and the NATO alliance. And so I introduced that as a factor. I think the PRC will perceive an opportunity with respect to ending the autonomy of Taiwan, although I think it will probably not take that opportunity. The opportunity comes from, of course, U.S. distraction in military terms, and the virtual exhaustion of precision-guided munitions already in Ukraine, combined with the need to provide significant numbers of air defense munitions and other resources to Israel to support Iron Dome. That combination means that if there was ever a time, a window of opportunity for the PRC to use its preponderant military advantages over Taiwan at a time when the U.S. and the West is distracted, it is probably now. However, the fragility of the economy within the PRC, with the property crisis, the broader fragility of the global economy, and the possibility that such a war, in terms of military escalation, in terms of the effect on the global chip market and other things, could actually do more harm to PRC stability. Again, I think this will be debated within the PRC, but I suspect that the PRC will probably avoid this opportunity, wait to see what happens with the 2024 Taiwan election. So to come back to then, what does this all mean for the global order? One of the articles, as you know, that I've written over this, even before these events, I talk about what I see and completely agree with my predecessor, that this is really understood as China. This is understood as always transitory and partial world orders. But what I see as the general trend right now is a transitional state, which I would call, on the one hand, a rising China pursuing its own interests, trying to rewire the world in that image, largely successfully, and at the same time, what I would call a illiberal global counterorder. For me, the important thing about this so-called illiberal order is there is no consensus in terms of objectives. We can talk about states like Iran and Saudi Arabia, which are rivals, and yet at the same time, both have interests in the weakening of certain parts of the system, and especially in terms of certain norms with respect to democracy and sanctions and things like that. We can talk about Russia in another way. We can talk about Venezuela in another way. To me, what is actually happening is there is a dynamic which is producing an emerging order. That dynamic has to do with each of those states are empowered by economic interactions with China, which helps them to escape the dependency on the established institutions of the West and the United States. China makes a lot of money off of that by buying Russian oil at a discount, by buying Russian agricultural products at a discount, by pursuing up to $400 billion in investment projects in Iran as it buys its oil. And yet at the same time, that China also benefits indirectly from the attacks by those actors on the established order, to the extent it gives China leverage and distracts its principal rivals, specifically the United States, as long as those attacks don't go so far to put China's broader interest in jeopardy. And so when I look at the current situations, I've just outlined it, I see certainly the events, the conflict in Ukraine and in the Middle East, as long as it stays within certain norms. For example, that it stays confined to Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, and not extends to a U.S.-Iran conflict itself. but within that framework, essentially the key actors of that illiberal counter order have all been strengthened. Russia with the situation in Ukraine, Iran with the escalation now, the marginalization of the U.S. and the rule of law, the weakening possibly in the coming year of U.S.-EU cooperation over Europe, et cetera, et cetera. A few parts of context I would also emphasize. Number one, globally, without getting into too much details, the political transformation and the weakening of the order has given new opportunities to the criminal economies, especially with respect to certain types of drugs and money laundering flows. The information transition with respect to the new media dynamics that we see have augmented polarization, putting democracies at risk, even with respect to the U.S.'s own democracy, once unthinkable. So all of those things tend to further undermine the ability of the institutions of the order to the pre-existing order to show success in responding and confronting and providing a counterexample to this deterioration. It was mentioned also briefly other things, the rise of new institutions like the expanded BRICS, the slow demise of the dollar. Some other questions I just want to throw out there because I think there are important strategic dynamics in the context of all of these things with respect to the evolution of artificial intelligence and especially its dynamics in information space and thus its impact on democracies and democratic institutions. I would also point out again, China becoming somewhat more bold in terms of its strategic engagement with the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, including a data focus, and its Global Civilizational Initiative, which does not directly challenge the ideas of the democracy and human rights, but puts forth an alternative, what I would call an unenforceable concept. If you can't say that anybody is actually wrong, then the state which is the most powerful and able to coordinate its own interests is supreme. And then just to conclude, I think there are still a couple big questions in the process of this very complex transition. Number one is what will happen with the very fragile Chinese economy and the broader global economy. And number two, and just I want to highlight this, was mentioned by the previous speaker as well. I think there are a couple key players as these things play out. And one of the players which finds itself in a fascinating position right now, of course, is India with respect, as was alluded to, its position with respect to Russia, its position in supporting democratic institutions and norms in some areas, its perception of rivalry with China, and yet it's being caught up within certain structures that go to the common India-China developing world ties, such as the expanded BRICS. And so in many ways, I see India among a handful of others as very key players in terms of finding themselves caught up in many of these evolving dynamics. And I think some of the choices that the Indian government makes, among others, will be particularly impactful to the way this plays out. So thank you very much. I look forward to questions and answers.
All right. I think that was a very detailed, in-depth, and quite informative presentation, and particularly from the point of view of what is the impact of the Middle East conflict and the escalatory trend that it has. Probably there is something which we could probably explore towards the Q&A session, that how far would China commit itself in protecting one of its allies or proxies or whatever you say in the Middle East, and how far it will go. That could be one of the discussions, as I can see there are a lot of predictions on this line. And the other one that probably, which is not covered in the deliberation, is that obviously there are some material factors that's coming into play, oil price increase and all the other things, but there is also an ideational decay here of the value-based diplomacy that the West is playing or is promoting, that comes into strain in some context when we say the humanitarian pause is not, which is supported by so many countries, is not been agreed by the United States, and particularly when you see the world order from a constructivist lens, the ideational factors gets a battering of through this battle that is going on in Middle East, and probably that has some impact on the future world order. And with that, I will turn to Professor Simon Reich. I know you have been extensively writing on constructivism, and your books are on that line. So hand over to you, sir. Please go ahead with your thoughts and remarks on these slides.
Thank you very much. It's a very elegant segue on your part. I appreciate it. What I'm going to talk about in the little time I have today, I strictly stuck to what does the emerging world order look like, and so I'm going to try and address that with references to a few examples drawn from around the globe, and then hope we can come back to the kind of sophisticated detail that Evan offered us in the question time and discussion period. The way I decided to talk about it today was to begin with the point that there seems to be a certain fetishism out there about a discussion about whether the world remains unipolar or is shifting to some form of bipolarity or multipolarity itself. And most of those listening in, I suspect from the Indo-Pacific, would like to argue that we're really moving towards a multipolar world. I think their comments are often more aspirational or wishful thinking in my sense. And the reason why I say that is because I don't think any of those traditional terms capture the current reality. I don't think that thinking about structures of power in that traditional sense is very useful. Richard Higgin and I have been working on a project for some time about the notion of what we call fuzzy bifurcation, which we think best characterizes the system, which is builds upon the work of people like Amitav Acharya's view of a multiplex world, in which those traditional alliance structures that underline our conception of polarities of one kind or another are really in question. As Indu mentioned at the start, we published a couple of short pieces that I can refer you to. One was last week in the Eurasia Review, which might be familiar to people in the Indo-Pacific. Another is called the Transatlantic Quarterly Review, which is actually a Turkish-based journal. So Ali might be familiar with that one, right? These are all building off a major article we published last year, which is freely accessible in the journal Global Policy, which is a British journal. So you can access it there if any of my comments today catch your attention. So the term fuzzy bifurcation. Why bifurcation? Well, it's clear from any realistic measure of material capabilities that the US and China have and will remain by far the most materially capable of any two states in the world. And that material capability is exemplified by the fact that if you think about the three domains of diplomacy, economics, and military power, forms of power, that only those two countries have consistently those capacities across all three domains. So the EU, for example, has an economic capacity, but it lacks a military capacity. India aspires to have that kind of capacity, but doesn't match it in any of the three domains. There was a mention of Russia. Russia's economic power is diminutive. Okay, so although it has tremendous global reach militarily because of its nuclear capacity, its economic capacities outside of fossil fuels, and that influence is diminishing in response to Western measures. The fact is that economically, it's not even, you can't even characterize it as a regional power. Many BRICS, Brazil, for example, are regionally influential, but their global capacity is at most disruptive. Bifurcation, however, is not the same thing as bipolarity. There may be two poles forming, a Chinese-based pole and an American one, but they are not coalescing into the kind of blocks that we associate with bipolarity. There is far more fuzzy permeability. There is far more fluidity in the global system rather than the consistency of alliance structures that we witnessed during the Cold War. essentially, you know, if the British aligned with the during the Cold War, if the British aligned with the Americans on security, they would align with them axiomatically, whether it was ideational reasons or whether it was because they were cajoled and coerced in these many other areas. So bifurcation is two poles of attraction, but it is not the kind of structure that we associate with bipolarity. Yet I also characterized it as fuzzy bifurcation. What do I mean when I use the term fuzzy? Traditional alliance structures simply don't apply in the current context. The US and China are constantly embroiled in a charm offensive, trying to attract the support of allies, frenemies, and even adversaries across a plethora of policy issues. But those temporary relationships are expedient. They're dependent on a particular issue in question at a particular time. They don't translate into enduring, consistent alliances across issues in a way that we did during the Cold War, when support in one area inevitably, often reluctantly, ensured support across others. So this is more than hedging, because hedging implies a certain consistency in behavior. And what we're actually witnessing is somewhat of an inconsistency in behavior. There are some countries that, you know, do demonstrate a degree of consistency. Russia, in its relationship with China, is relatively consistent, of course, because of their alliance without limits. Australia in the Indo-Pacific is relatively consistent with the United States, but they are truly the exceptions rather than the rules. Let me give you a few examples. Saudi Arabia. It wants to be an American security partner. This is one of the elements that was being negotiated in the relationship with Israel, right? The normalization relationship. But even when President Biden visited Saudi Arabia and asked them to pump more oil, he was unceremoniously and undiplomatically rebuffed. Okay. South Africa, another BRIC. It carries out, it's a senior American trading partner. The United States is one of its largest trading partners, but it conducts military exercises with China and Russia. Israel tried its absolute best to maintain cordial relations with the Russians, while at the same time asking Russia to condemn Hamas, and that's an example of failure that has pushed them towards the Americans. But they've tried to maintain that relationship. Turkey, of course, is a wonderful example of what I'm talking about, a member of NATO. But Erdogan pronounces his support for Hamas, defames his European NATO partners on occasion, and Hungary, Orban has just compared the EU to the Soviet occupation of Hungary, right? And says the EU strategy in Ukraine has failed. So to say there's a certain ambivalence there is an understatement. Various Asian countries also reflect this kind of ambivalence, right? So whether we look at South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, major trading partners with China, but countries that have security relations with the United States, we can go back and forth about this. And of course, my best example, I think my favorite example in many ways, is the Europeans who bandwagon with the United States against the Russians vis-a-vis Ukraine, but have been arguing and disagreeing incessantly with the Americans on issues of trade, on issues of digitalization, on issues of climate change. And that last subject, how the Europeans respond to fuzzy bifurcation, is the subject of my forthcoming book with Richard Higgett that we're working on. So having talked about this generalization, how does this characterization appertain to the Ukraine war? After all, we were asked to talk about the emerging order and the Ukraine war. So let me spend a couple of concluding minutes on that, right? So the Europeans, of course, classically bandwagon on the US for military support. The European contribution towards the costs of the Ukraine war has been growing, but is skewed largely towards humanitarian aid and assistance, paying for refugees, et cetera, rather than for material, right? Military material. So the United States is still the largest proportionate contributor of any one country when it comes to providing the Ukrainians with material. Yet, as I mentioned before, some EU members like Hungary and more recently like Slovakia after the recent election, as well as numerous non-EU countries, but NATO countries such as Turkey, assail the EU's support for Ukraine and refuse to join the sanctions embargo against Russia and maintain their links to Moscow. Okay, so you're seeing that ambivalence playing out in the context of the Ukraine war. Relative to the Indo-Pacific, which is more the focus of this audience, the fuzziness is most evident when it comes to the issue of enforcing the sanctions regime against Russia, right? So the Indians, for example, and maybe, I'm not sure I disagree with previous comments, but maybe if I understood them correctly, I am disagreeing. India, for example, buys more Russian oil than ever, while it flirts with the US in terms of its contribution to the Quad, and flirts with the US in terms of its military commitments and partnerships with the United States. That's part of an old story. That is not something that is something that long predates the Ukraine war. Jessica Burton, a doctoral student of mine, is in Delhi at the moment interviewing Russian officials going back 30 years in all kinds of areas of security about this ambivalence that India has towards American security relations. But the Ukraine war scenario plays into that very consistently. Europeans, on the other hand, are told by the Americans, well, we really would like to have a division of labor in which you people contribute more to the Ukraine war and we focus more on issues like Taiwan. The Europeans, however, say no. The French say, we are a Pacific nation, because they have two dots on the map in islands in the Pacific. So they say, we are a Pacific nation, and therefore we maintain the right to act in the Pacific and conduct freedom of navigation operations in the South and East China Seas, in conflict with American preferences. The Americans would much rather see them focus their efforts on Europe. So when we go back and forth, right, we see this fuzziness playing out, this permeability across issue areas. It's a much more messy world, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an underlying dynamic that we can identify. We call it fuzzy bifurcation. Where does it leave us? In conclusion, the Ukraine war is a magnifier, perhaps even a precursor of this dynamic evolving global system. It's one that attempts to group states under alliances, but those alliance structures are doomed to fail. American claims, the Biden administration claims about the distinction between democratic and authoritarian regimes has little value, has been largely ineffective, and it's understandably so. This dynamic system that we're describing is best characterized by contingency and fluidity. Credibility and trust interact in this system and become far more important as America, for example, or China, attempts to build their credibility across these different issue areas in order to attract support for specific policy issues. The relationship between the diplomatic, the economic, and military power have therefore often work subtly in often nuanced ways, because the simple compulsion of instituting what we call compulsory power, sticks and carrots, right, simply doesn't work in a way that it did when you had in the Cold War period, when you had a bipolar structure. The United States and China wrestle for influence in the world, sometimes successfully, sometimes ineffectively. When the Americans say the invasion of Ukraine is about protecting democracy, instead of initially saying it's about protecting international law and the influence of international law, then the United States loses credibility. That was Biden's fallback position. It shouldn't have been strategically his fallback position. He should have talked about international law and sovereignty at the outset. It looks pallid when he talks so afterwards. On the other hand, the Chinese, when they devolve into wolf diplomacy, right, warrior wolf diplomacy, do themselves no favors. Countries don't wish to be controlled because they have options. This new world will certainly feel destabilizing, as one of the previous speakers mentioned, for traditional great power holders. It's a destabilizing world because of the fluidity, because of what they see as inconsistently. But it would be a strategic mistake for them not to understand that as a result of this new fluidity, countries have greater strategic... Somebody's talking
Thank you,
over me.
Sadia.
Sorry. It would be a strategic mistake for the great powers not to understand that countries have greater strategic autonomy, greater choice than ever before. To retrieve that credibility, China and the United States will likely require the greater cooperation and assistance of each other as we move ahead, so that that fluidity and that contingency extends to those two powers. Candidly, and I say this as a good American, I want to stress this, the United States is ill-prepared for this world. China is better prepared for this world. The Chinese have demonstrated a capacity, although they make some mistakes occasionally, the Chinese have clearly demonstrated greater capacity for dealing with this ambivalence based on their historic record than the Americans. We tend to, want to reinforce those traditional alliance structures and think because somebody's in NATO, they're going to agree with us on other issues. The reality is they won't. Still, the United States the American administration's selective regard for international law and the institutions of global governance do not tally well with this dilution of influence. If they want to establish their credibility, they're going to have to be more consistent with the kind of ideational values that might be called part of the liberal international order, but those elements of those values that have proven consistent with the attributes of global governance in the past. Of course, I leave you with the salutary point that the re-election of Donald Trump next year, were it to take place, would undermine that process entirely, because American credibility took a hit. I don't work for a government department. I'm an academic, so I'm allowed to say those things. Of course, the Chinese position, in conclusion, is based on its performance capacity. And so Chinese credibility will suffer if, as we suspect, and as we are told at the moment, that Chinese capacity, Chinese performance is diminishing. I apologize if I didn't keep an eye on the time. I apologize if I spoke too long, but I hope I made a contribution. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Reich, for the wonderful presentation. But now, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Nagalaxmi and then Dr. Ali. Very soon we will call you, and then we will moving ahead to the QA session. Professor Nagalaxmi, over to you, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Indu ma'am. And of course, I thank CIPR for giving me this opportunity to express my views. This topic is really wonderful. I heard the panelists here. So everybody is having different views. I'm also going to give my own view here. So very good evening and good morning to all. And for me, it's good evening. So for the rest, good morning. Thank you. So talking about this again, I'll just start with the basic perception that there is a growing perception that liberal world order is coming to an end. While the current multilateral system may be weakened by a return of geopolitics, economic interdependence, and transnational ties that will prevent a complete lapse into anarchy. The Ukraine war is set to fundamentally transform the international order, providing new impetus for what some call the world's de-Westernization. We cannot understand this order without hearing from those said to be its main architects, countries from Global South. Here, whatever opinion I'm giving expressed are truly personal that do not represent institute. The Ukraine war is set to be fundamentally transform the international order, providing new impetus for what some call, as I said, world de-Westernization. The Russian-Ukraine war against Ukraine, so Russian war against Ukraine and the growing US-China rivalry will have a profound effect on the future of world's political organization. The West hoped for an international system based on democracy, rule of law, and multilateral cooperation, which had already lost plausibility in the recent years. The new looks are totally wholly unrealistic. The current trends and the recent strategic documents point towards a further ramping up of geopolitical competition, increasing economic protectionism and fragmentation, and loosening of the structures of international order. But, however, the economic interdependence and transnational ties will likely remain strong enough to prevent a complete lapse into anarchy and unrestrained competition. Even so, there is a great risk that capacity of meeting global challenges such as like we have climate change, world poverty, global health threats will be really badly damaged. Almost a year after this Russia's wars against Ukraine started, it actually united the West. According to 15 country survey, the survey was actually done by European Council on Foreign Relations, exposed widening gulf with the rest of the world that is defining the contours of future global order. This ECFR is a think tank that surveyed opinions in the 9 EU member states, which includes France, Germany, Poland, Britain, and the US, as well as China, Russia, India, and Turkey. It revealed a sharp geographical differences in the attitudes of towards war, democracy, and the global balance of power. The authors here suggesting Russia's aggression may be an historic turning point, making the emergence of post-Western world order. The paradox of Ukraine war is that the West is both more united and less influential in the world than ever before. The way in which the US and its allies orchestrated the economic warfare against Russia, which is primarily based on the monopoly of US dollar and almost monopoly of the Western financial infrastructure, which includes, we can here talk about the international payment system, insurance, currency reserves, and so on. This moved many nations into a question, how to avoid such a critical dependence. It will not happen very soon, but sooner than we could imagine, profoundly again shifting the international landscape. This movement towards a new order and away from the hegemonic one has started and will continue. On the other hand, Russia was not able to get strong support from many countries, including instances in Central Asia. Russia is implementing its own security agenda with very harsh methods. This is a national task as formulated by the leadership and basically supported by the large part of population. Russia did not consult anybody and did not ask for advice between Russian leadership, but it convinced that it should be done, despite how the rest of the world views it. In such a situation, it would strange to expect a strong support from anybody. But the very fact that many countries remain neutral or expresses understanding is important per se. As far as Central Asia is concerned, expectation that this region will become an what do you call apple of discord between Russia and China are not new. As always, the reality is finer and more nuanced. The main reason why it is not happening is that Central Asian countries are much more sophisticated than one suggests. All of them know that. I'll just again give a pointers that they need to keep friendly and balanced relations with powerful neighbors. They feel that more comfortable Russia due to cultural and historical closeness and then economic gravity of Russian space. They try to use economic opportunities offered by China, but know exactly that there is no such thing as free cheese. They follow the changes in the international environment to fine-tune their policies to ask who will overtake Central Asia means to be arrogant vis-a-vis of those states. Even if Russia wins on the ground in Ukraine, it looks like it is doomed to end up in a bad shape that is more dependent on China, isolated from the West, maybe keeping some support in the global South, but with less capacity for influence. Do you have a different view here? Russia is facing an enormous challenges, no doubt about that. The Russian leadership decides that the path of the last 30 years was wrong and should change. The Soviet Union, by the end of its history, experienced a very sharp political economic decline, but paradoxically was at peak of country's technological capacity, to talk about that, and strategic self-sufficiency. The decision to open up and integrate into globalized international environment led to improved conditions for part of population, but loss of many skills and rapidly increasing dependency on international markets. As a risk of oversimplifying, we talk about India's view of the current world order can be summed up in 3 words: unequal, discriminatory, and unrepresentative. India traditionally shielded away from the global balance of power games, both to ensure its periphery in South Asia remains pre-Cold War politics and due to lack of capacity. And yet, there were times when India did emerge in balancing against China by reaching out to US after 1962 Sino-India War and signing treaty of peace and friendship with the erstwhile USSR during Bangladesh liberation in 1971. Ukraine crisis has pushed Russia and China closer together, thereby sharpening both intra-EU as also US-EU divide in their Indo-Pacific visions. The fact that only about 50 countries have implemented sanctions against Russia also shows the unwillingness of global South to confront Russia. Apart from a few small states traditionally aligned the Western countries, the great majority of developing nations did not wish to sanction Russia. The Russian narrative that the US and NATO bear a major responsibility for the conflict found open years in many developing countries. Anti-Western sentiments partly again fueled this legacy of colonialism, and resentment against Western double standards played role. A strong wish to stay outside the conflict between the big powers was also an important factor here. So many developing countries will likely to continue to strive to stay out of this fight between China and Russia and the West. India, which is overtaking China in terms of population, will likely to become the world's 3rd largest economy before end of the decade. So this will probably be a strong force in favor of such a multipolar world. So I would like to rest here my presentation here. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity and patience listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nagalaxmi. We will take more on the QA session. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Mohammad Ali for his remarks. Dr. Ali, please, over to you.
Thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yes, sir.
How about now?
Mhm.
Yes, it's clear.
Great. I wanted to, I do have a meeting in 15 minutes, so I will try to make my comments brief. I really appreciate everyone's opinions today. Dr. Reich was very frank in saying, you know, he's not a captive of Uncle Sam, my favorite uncle. But even Dr. Ellis and I, you know, have academic freedom, so not representing the official government position, but do have this ability to talk and have an academic dialogue. So I appreciate everyone's open and honest appraisal of the world state. So I wanted to do a friendly amendment to the title of our a panel and call it, instead of the emerging world order, I wanted to call it the emerging universal order. And I wanted to take a moment of time to just talk briefly about the growing militarization of space, and I'll put it bluntly as thus. And U.S. Perhaps leading those efforts in some ways by creating a new branch of the armed forces focused exclusively on space. I'll let you just look at those sort of areas that the new Space Force, which was created almost 4 years ago, undertake. The Space Force, there are a few direct report smaller organizations, but the primary field commands are the Space Operations Command, Space Systems Command, and the Space Training and Readiness Command, which is nicknamed or abbreviated as STARCOM. My organization actually falls under that last command, and you can see the complexity of STARCOM, which has training and range and aggressor duties and test evaluations, doctrine, wargaming, education, with all the subunits under what we term deltas, which are the equivalent to I guess not a regiment, but I'm not sure the Army term, a wing for the Air Force. Maybe Dr. Ellis, you could help me out with the with the Army terminology. Anyways, all of this is a lead in to say that space obviously is an issue. The Ukraine war has brought to the fore a lot of issues connected to how we're using the assets in space to undertake combat. If you look at the Gulf War between the U.S. and its allies in Iraq in 1991, that's sometimes termed the first space war, and there was utilization of satellite communications and especially GPS assets to hone in on the Iraqi military targets that the U.S. undertook. And the Iraq had no capabilities on this, so it was a real one-sided conflict. The Ukraine-Russia war, though, could be declared as perhaps the first full two-sided war, with both sides having utilized what's out there. So one of the big features that I know all of us have seen in the news, reading reports, etc., is the use of satellite imagery. Very beginning, even before the invasion, Maxar, one of the leading satellite corporations, released photos of the buildup, despite any Russian denials accordingly. It was quite obvious that there were troop buildups, and the ability of the use of satellite imagery to look at troop buildups, troop movements, the targeting impacts, damage assessment, even the documentation of negative impacts to cultural heritage sites. These are all part of the use of satellite imagery. You see on the bottom right some 3D imagery. I believe this is from a Japanese company. And again, really getting some ground truth on the impacts of weapon systems, fighting, and what has happened to whichever side the attack has gone on. The satellite imagery, was been formerly a domain just of the nation states, whether it's the CIA, speaking for the American side, CIA, National Reconnaissance Office, but really now we have so much civilian presence in these fields. Maxar, as I had described before, Planet Labs is another big corporation who have designed these very real small satellites. They weigh about, I think, 4 kilos or something, less than 10 pounds. I think they're called Dove satellites, and the imagery from those very small units can be of high resolution and benefit. China is growing in this capacity. They're I think public-private partnership, if you will, corporation Seaway is continuing to launch new satellites and new capabilities out there. So lots of things to be thinking about as warfare changes in the future. Obviously, another huge element in space-based assets is the communications intelligence. You folks probably have heard how SpaceX sent thousands of Starlink terminals to Ukraine in order to get rigid and robust comms and decentralized comms, right, out into the field. The ability to figure out how to target troops who are using their mobile phones. The ability to crowdsource information. There's I looked at this website several months ago, the Center for Disinformation Resilience. It's sort of a crowdsourced node, if you will, where people are uploading satellite images, videos and photos from down on the ground, and you can triangulate, if you will, what's happening there, and again, how to position your troops, how to be effective on the ground tactics, etc. The communications are even key for being able to improve morale, where folks will be able to call their families using, again, the satellite comms, etc. So again, moving quickly here as we're approaching the end of this half hour. So I encourage us to be very mindful of what's to come, right? So with all of this, there are great vulnerabilities to these space assets, and again, coupling with the growing militarization. I mean, you see enhancements in cyber attacks. On the very first day of the invasion, Russia apparently attacked, did a cyber attack against the Viasat's broadband network, fixed broadband network, which actually had civilian implications outside of the Russia-Ukraine theater. It wiped out internet access for hundreds of thousands of people in Central and Western Europe. There's also this growing capability of shadowing satellites. Russia has done this. China has developed a new capability where their S-17 satellite has a robotic arm which could attack another satellite. India is moving and conducted Operation Shakti in 2000. I think 2018 or 19, where they launched an anti-satellite missile from the ground. France has openly declared they're going to develop lasers, anti-satellite lasers. So there's a growing competition and militarization of space. And there are concerns also about much of the assets that are in space don't belong to the nation states. They belong to private commercial entities. So who controls that information? Will those private corporations be targets from other nations, depending? All of this leads leads me to think, we really need to think about how to use these things for our defense, but we also it's a great time to take a pause and take a look at the Outer Space Treaty of January of 1967, which undoubtedly needs to be updated. It doesn't expressly ban all military activities or the placement of conventional weapons in space. It does things like forbids military bases or military maneuvers on different celestial bodies. But we're at a juncture in our time of human living where we should be conscious and knowledgeable about all that's going on far above us. So with that, I have to leave, and I do appreciate the time to share a few thoughts and have this dialogue, and I look forward to continuing conversations elsewhere. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Mehmed, for the wonderful presentation. Now, I would like to invite co-chair of this conference, Mr. Chris Kowalowski, for conducting the QA session. And hopefully the audience, please send the questions or you can ask the question. Chris, over to you, please.
Thanks very much. Some of you may or may not know that I run the military history team here at the consortium. And I was glad to see this panel because one of the things that we have said in some of our publications and podcasts is how war in Europe, particularly if you look at the history of the Indo-Pacific in the last 115 years, war in Europe creates opportunities for rising Asiatic powers. And we're seeing something like that. I've seen some references from some folks that analogizing what's going on with 1937. And I think a lot of these conversations we're having today, just simply reinforce and refine those points. I was particularly struck by some of the comments, particularly with the BRICS, and some people saying that there are not necessarily enough countries to be strong, but could be disruptive within their regions. And so I'd be curious if anybody, I'll take the prerogative, if you don't mind, Indu, since I have the floor and we're going to go to Q&A, to ask the first question of, is there any particular countries or factors that you see as we go forward that, say, the top 2 or 3 that you see might really drive where we're going, or kind of the 2 or 3 things that you watch and say, this is what I need to pay attention to because it's going to be a key factor as the world order transitions, to borrow a phrase from one of the presenters as well. So I'll throw that to anybody in the panel that might want to address that or fall on that grenade.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead. Evan's got his hand up first, so I'll go to him and then I'll go to. We'll go from there.
To Simon, I have a question not really a question actually.
Hang on just a second. Go ahead, Evan.
Okay. No, thanks. So in my thinking of understanding this transitional order, I'm motivated by complexity theory and just understanding the interdependence and more important to look at the dynamics than necessarily one state or another state. But within those dynamics, as I you mentioned before, there are certain things that could happen to significantly disrupt the outcome. Of course, I mentioned I think the very real risks within the context of global interdependency of a China-led economic meltdown or another economic-led meltdown. Indeed, the interdependence between a possible escalation of conflict, certainly with Iran, but possibly a China action over Taiwan, and the interaction with the global economic order and how that reverberates those economic disruptions in shaping the political composition of the rest of the world. And so I think that is one determinant, although seemingly of I would say less importance, but as several other speakers pointed out, many of the key I hate to use the term middle powers, but there are a number of, I think, decisive actors here whose posture will shape how some of these things play out. Again, I mentioned India in my remarks, with competing interests on various different sides. And so, for example, the position, in my judgment, of India to not object to the dilution of its influence in the BRICS and permit this China-led push to expand the BRICS to include Iran and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and others. And again, in my mind, sometimes these decisive points enable other paths. And so, for example, one of the things, although I think it's going to be complicated for the BRICS, is the BRICS and others getting real traction on the move away from the dollar and the SWIFT system. And at the end of the day, as a geopolitical thing, the degree to which that occurs, that the incremental loss of the United States as a receipt of where the world wants to put its money and the impact on our ability to borrow and thus pursue programs in combination with our difficulties in political paralysis could really complicate the U.S. response to a rising China. And so I look at some of those types of tipping points and choices, not merely for their actions, but for the series of things that they empowered down the line. But I'll stop there, but great question.
Thanks for that. Seeing no other responses, I think we had a question from the audience. So General Kareem, I'll tee you up to ask what you wanted.
Yeah, I just have not really a question. I am seeking a clarification from Simon Rick. You talked about that fuzzy bifurcation. It's a very interesting term that you have used, and I'm a little confused about that. But I'm in a way convinced about your logic, your argument. As you said that the world will not be, in groups or blocks. It will all be fluid, and there's fluidity in that. And you are saying that the world will be divided into two poles of attraction. Am I correct in understanding that you said China-led pole and the American-led pole? Am I correct? Where EU is getting divided, or for military support they go to they bandwagon the Americans. For economy is fine, but do you think that another pole might come up in the Middle East? Say Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia combined.
It's a very good question, and the short answer is no. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at the Saudis, if you look at the Iranians, I mean, first of all, we understand there's a regional conflict which is playing out in the Middle East, and it's a regional conflict that has been playing out for approximately 1,000 years, okay? And it's a regional conflict that today we call Iran, but it's a certain form of Islam, and Saudi Arabia, we call it the other, but it's a certain form of Islam, and that transcends nation states, okay? But both of those actors remain contingent, reliant upon one of these two poles. The Saudis, have a lot of economic capacity, but it's very limited in terms of fossil fuel and, of course, the money that accrues from that. But security-wise, they remain reliant under the United States umbrella. And the Iranians, for all their for all their verbiage and all their declarations, etc., they really still economically relate because of the embargo from the West. They are reliant on the Chinese. These are, you know, in the Iranian case, it's one of those rare examples where they do tend to align. That I mentioned, you know, there are exceptions that do really have to align with China and Russia because they have nowhere else to go. But if you cut off that supply to the Iranians, then they would be in remarkably bad shape, technologically, economically, in terms of aid and support and assistance. So these two, when I say poles, I really want to draw a distinction between poles and blocks, okay? Because for most of the countries in the world, most, including the actors in the global south that people are talking about here, the United States and China have to wrestle, have to compete in, the term I used was a charm offensive to get their support, but it's highly contingent. It can be on one issue, but it won't be on another issue. So expectations that the United States may have about reciprocity, we're supporting the Europeans on Ukraine, so we expect their support on other issues, it just isn't materializing. It just doesn't work that way. We look in our own specific project on Europe, and we look at 4 different issue areas: digitalization, trade, climate change, and security. And we find very different patterns of behavior and relationships between the United States and Europe, dependent on the issue area. So I think that, you know, fluidity and contingency, those are the 2 characteristic features of this global system. Countries like India, for example, right? India's been mentioned. They get to benefit from this enormously. Countries like Pakistan get to benefit from this enormously because there is a competition. It's, you know, a love fest from both sides, coming from both sides. How can we attract you? How can we, you know, and this is likely to play itself out. You know, I am not big on predictions. I respect and admire Evan's willingness to talk about how he thinks things are going to play out. But, you know, I thought Margaret Thatcher would last as British Prime Minister for a year, and I thought Donald Trump would never get elected. So I have given up on prediction. I don't do it anymore, right? So I say this with a somewhat the limit. I think that we're into this period of what we're calling fuzzy bifurcation for the next decade or so. You know, there may be some black swan that, and Evan alluded to that just now. There may be some black swan that hits us, you know, whether it's a war that we don't expect that might consolidate. I don't think events in the Middle East right now are going to consolidate those blocks, right? It might marginally move the Israelis marginally move towards the United States until the United States tells them, well, we want you to stop. Right. And then the Israelis marginally move away. So there'll be some incrementally shifts, but it's not going to consolidate any blocks. I mean, the Saudis have basically done nothing and said nothing so far, right? About events in Gaza. Nothing. So Bahrain, you know, has pulled out of the accord. And that's a shame from the Israelis' point of view. That's diplomatically a shame, but it doesn't move the needle. Okay. And so obviously, if it precipitates tumult, right, and it starts piling on, then the dynamic will change. But I think we're into this very fluid period, and I think this is only to the advantages of the BRICS. Somebody mentioned de-dollarization. Sorry, I want to shut up, but somebody didn't mention de-dollarization, right? And I've been reading some stuff on de-dollarization, and you know, de-dollarization is a really hard thing to do. Why? Because you don't have an alternative, right? So the Chinese want to trade with the Venezuelans in terms, or was it the Venezuelans or the Brazilians in terms of using local currencies? Okay, that's what, 0.01% of the global market. Don't think that's gonna affect things, right? Certainly not in the short term. But we live in interesting times, that's for sure.
Can Can I make a
Sir.
few observations? Very quick one.
Please.
We're talking about the future, and it's not prediction. You don't have to predict about the future, but having a perspective planning and perspective thinking, both are very, very important. So let me make a few observations. Number one is about the nuclear issues that we have not talked about. Putin repeatedly mentioned about the nuclear capability, and very recently they have revoked the CTBT. And as and when the Russian Duma was debating and about to approve revocation of CTBT, the United States conducted a nuclear test in Nevada. It has not hit the headlines around the world, but it has done it. Around the same time, Pakistan also tested a nuclear-powered missile. Around the same time, 2 days, 3 days this side, that side, North Korean parliament passed a resolution saying that we are no longer going to join any talk on nuclear arms elimination in Korean Peninsula. Japanese, they're a microscopic minority, but some of them are pushing for a nuclear capability. How long they're going to mortgage their security to the United States? South Korea recently was hinting that if the US is not going to support them beyond a point, they might go nuclear. So when you talk about the future, I have a feeling that in the Indo-Pacific region, you may be surprised that non-proliferation TT will be going through the roof, and new nuclear powers may emerge. Number two, watch China. Quite often we talk about the power of China, the largest importer, largest exporter, economically very powerful now, competing with the United States. Artificial intelligence is fantastic. They're going to compete with the US even on technology aspect, so many things. But also watch the negative things happening within China. The economy is slowing down. There was a banking crisis recently. There was such a huge energy crisis that many, many big companies had to either reduce their working hours or they had to shut down factories and all. And then, of course, the real estate meltdown. Real estate in China contributes about 33% to the GDP. Now, companies like Evergrande and all, they are going bankrupt. Evergrande went to the US to file the insolvency case. So the problem about the future, when I think, is China too powerful. Of course, it is posing a big challenge in the neighborhood. If the Chinese meltdown, becomes severe, it will have a different kind of ramification for the global economy and even for the economy in the Indo-Pacific. So we have to watch. Number three, watch India. When I was going to school, I used to drink milk. I used to get milk powder, which came from the United States of America, PL480. Today, India is one of the largest producers of milk. If you go through the Food and Agriculture Organization data, almost all the agricultural goods, including livestock, India's position is in the top 5 in the world in terms of production. There are poor people, there are people dying out of hunger, but in terms of absolute ability, India is no longer dependent on food from abroad. India's GDP is larger than the British GDP today. And India has a young population. China, Japan, and South Korea are aging very fast. It's a very, very big problem there. That is why many people say that China will first age before they become a great power and all that. So we have to watch how all these demographic things are going to unfold in the future, which is going to affect the emerging order. Finally, the role of the social media, the internet. It has changed relationship between people, within the families, between the countries, and the kind of information war that we are watching. That is how it is going to affect even perception of people is important. Like for example, on the Ukraine issue, the Americans think in a different way, the Europeans think in a different way. Large number of countries, the vast majority of countries do not think that the Russian attack on Ukraine is such a cataclysmic change on them or on the world order. They think totally differently. It is Europe's war. And that is why all these things, all these opinions are shaped by social media, different kind of videos available to everyone and all that. So these things are going to affect the order in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for those thoughts. Lot to think about,
Can I
for
just
sure.
have one point for Professor Mahapatra. I just said you said fantastic. Indian economy has grown too large, $3.8 trillion, as I understand today. But your finance minister, former finance minister Chidambaram, was saying that your per capita income per head is even less than Bangladesh, that of Bangladesh. So it's not a robust economy. It's not a robust economy. Just an observation. From your former finance minister. Yeah.
Yeah, let me answer that. If you take into consideration per capita income, look at China also. China will never match the US in next 50 years. Ultimately, in the international relations, the individual citizens in the country don't play any role. It is the government, the power, the country as a whole. Otherwise, how do you explain that a little tiny country called Cuba, 89 kilometers off the coast of Florida, is still having a communist regime? The US could change regime in many parts of the world, not in Cuba. How do you explain that after fighting for 3 years in Korea, the US did not win the Korean War? How do you explain running away from Afghanistan? Taliban is back in power. So things are more complex than GDP per capita and all that. So how countries behave, how the governments behave in international relations do matter. It can be a small, tiny country. Look at Israel, for example. Until recently, everybody knew that Israel's Mossad is very powerful. The way Hamas attacked in 22 different places at one go synchronized, much worse than 9/11. So when you compare, countries in terms of power, wealth, capabilities and all, only military power will not help. Only intelligence will not help. Only economy will not help. It is a very complex mixture. That is why it is very difficult to understand how things are happening and how things are going to shape in the future. It is very complex. Fuzzy, as Reich said, fuzzy. I agree with that argument here.
Comprehensive national power. That's more important.
Dr. Khan has his hand
But
up.
also like that,
Please. I don't have any question. No.
Thank you very much. It's very stimulating discussion, and I just wanted to share some of my thoughts and correctly so. I mean, Professor Reich, your observation on this on the fuzzy logic. My first PhD supervisor was Martin Binder in Reading. You might be knowing he actually does a lot of research on state behaviors based on data, not exactly descriptives that most of us do. He takes the UN voting data from the Security Council and the General Assembly. I also maintain a database of the voting data because I think this is a good proxy of state learning the mind of the state. And a lot of the talks that has happened, it sort of doesn't match what empirics shows. For example, in the question of Ukraine, there were actually total 7 resolutions in emergency sessions, out of which overwhelming countries, 140 plus, voted in favor of condemning Russia. It was only in the cases of 3 resolutions which was regarding suspension of Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, reparation for the war damage, and the other one was something related to humanitarian things, in which there was less number of votes. So the assumption that there is a huge majority of the country in the world who is cool with sovereignty norm violation is not correct by evidence.
Right.
If you only take as a researcher the evidence of all the text and all the resolutions that has been put forward in the voting, it is just not one. There were 7 votes. So I actually have the voting data of India, Bangladesh, and this region, and some of my publications were on that. So that thing gone. But the other problem that I have actually to understand, and I'd request your panel's remarks on that, because I really don't find a valid contender representing the global South. And why do I say that? Although you may seem, India may seem that they have been promoting the global South cause, particularly in the G20 summit, in which there was a huge call for climate justice and all these. But do you know that for the very first time in the UN Security Council, when 131 countries brought a resolution to pass in the Security Council, upgrading this and climate change issue as a security threat, India voted against. That was a very surprising thing for many of these countries from the global south. And at the same time, if you take India's voting record in the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Pacific, Indo-Pacific, you will find that this does not match with the global south's aspiration or the small states' aspiration. And I've just highlighted also on the sovereignty realm, India has not only aligned with Russia during the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan in 1980. It was only one country in the region, in the South Asian region. China actually voted against the Russians. So how does it convince a small state in that region that, okay, this is the correct global South representative in an area? So that is what is the perplexing question for me. Thank you.
May I respond?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I would like to.
Just Dr. Professor Nagalaxmi want to say something. Okay.
Please. Yeah, I just wanted to add with what Professor Mahapatra had said. He has very rightly pointed out. I just wanted to add that this per capita income has the net national income of India has increased from 2011-12 to 2020-23. It has increased. If you talk about net national income, it has increased 35.12%. But if you go for GDP per capita, India is equivalent to 70% of world's average. So I just wanted to include those points of what Professor Mahapatra was talking about. I just wanted to add that.
Let me very briefly respond. You know, during the G20 summit, when India played a good, positive role diplomatically and invited the African Union to be a member of G20, I think that was leadership. When India had a meeting with all the G20 heads of government before the G20 summit and sought their opinion and views so that it could be represented at the G20 meeting, that was leadership. When India offered to all the developing countries its achievement in digital health, that is offering something to them, right? So nobody can claim that I'm the leader if NATO members and were not united when the US moved into Iraq in 2003. If NATO could not be united, you think India is going to unite all the global South? It's impossible. Even when there was non-aligned movement and group of 77, India was one of the leaders. All of them were having the same views? No. When India is talking about a globalization which should be global South sensitive and human-centric, is it not leadership of the interest of the global South? It is. India is simply articulating what is good for global South. India is not forcing anyone to accept whatever it is saying. And about the voting behavior in United Nations, anybody who understands the intricacies of international relations and does a little bit of archival research will find that in international relations, there is no popularity race at all. We all know how the United Nations functions. We know how the voting happens, not in the General Assembly, but during the coffee time, the decisions are taken. So on the basis of the voting behavior, if you try to analyze the state behavior and the reality of IR, then that may contribute to constructivism or ideational kind of concept, but not pragmatism. That is how I look at world politics.
Just a brief response to that. I think I'm doing this voting records and voting things much more comprehensively. And you're right in one aspect, probably a little bit, in that when you say, and there are controversies or the arguments about how should somebody read the voting records. So actually, U.S. Congress has a particular resolution also to make annual projection of different countries' voting records. But what you do is the serious researchers, what they do, and that's what I was working in the global governance, UN global governance program in the United States, in the University of Reading. What the serious researchers do is that they go down into the path dependency text of each resolutions, And then from there, the key resolutions, which are defining the state behavior. Remember, as opposed to what somebody says in a particular G20 summit, a statement, a declaration, a voting behavior, a voting decision is a epistemic community's decision. It is a combination of diplomats, political leaders.
Dr. Khan, I'm going to have to stop you right there. I've got a couple other folks that need to jump in, and we've also are coming up on time.
All right.
So we'll actually give the last word to Dr. Ellis, and then we'll bring it to Dr. Saxena to wrap up.
Thank you very much, and fantastic points. It's been a really rich discussion. I want to thank the group for this. I just wanted to respond to a couple of quick things. Number one, I think one can understand what I would call international identity politics. In other words, a concept like the global South, or a concept like affiliation with China. And of course, the excellent discussion about the difference between blocs and poles. And I think part of the issue is kind of understanding what the nature of affiliation, or what the nature of self-identification is, and what that says about the system. Because I think, the notion of identification with the global South, and thus how do you have somebody that unifies the global South, is it's complex, because you have to understand the nature and the reasons for those identities. Also, talking a little bit about prediction, I think in my own work, what I've come to realize is that like the weather, sometimes you can't say what's going to happen tomorrow, but it's important to understand what are the drivers behind the dynamics, but also that sometimes key events can, the combination of events and dynamics. And talking about that, I wanted to me, it's good that we had several people that made points about technology, about social media, about space, and there are an array of different technologies we could talk about. We have not talked about the advances in genetic coding and in biotechnologies, but to me, in understanding global dynamics, it's important not to say that technology will lead to the rise of the Terminator machines, to refer to that movie, but just understanding how, even with things like ChatGPT, things like social media, that has in some ways democratized, but also increased the polarization in our space, and has put more stress and made it more difficult for democracies, even that in the United States, to succeed. It's given authoritarian regimes new weapons to distort. And so when I look at the effects of technology, and again, I go the combination of dynamics and events. And so sometimes when I look at in Latin America and other places, the way that a particular election, which reflects social polarization, et cetera, leads to a choice which empowers a leader that takes the country in that direction, or a particular action, the transformative effect of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, or the terrorist attacks in Gaza, and how that creates a node that impacts everything that comes later. I just want, one thing also that I didn't talk about, but when we talk about some of the things that are important, it's almost become unthinkable, the detonation of a nuclear device, aside from proliferation. But there are certain key events which are probably entirely overdue, which, like other events that continue to surprise us, may transform the dynamics of the order. So lots of good things we could talk about, but again, congratulations to the group, I think, for a very rich discussion to understanding this very complex topic.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Indu, I'll let you bring us home.
Thank you, Chris. And I would like to thank all the participants and the speakers, panelists, and our knowledge partners for making this a very successful panel. And of course, the 3 days we have done a very good conversation like this panel, and hoping the last concluding day will go awesome. And thank you once again to be here, to giving your time and making it a successful panel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and pleasure to meet everybody.